In the twilight of a vast empire, when the sun seemed never to set on British dominions, an aging monarch sat alone in her palace, surrounded by portraits of the dead. The courtiers who walked the marble halls of Windsor Castle saw a figure still formidable, still commanding armies with a stroke of her pen, yet they whispered of her loneliness. Queen Victoria, ruler of more than 300 million souls, was, at heart, a widow in perpetual mourning. Nearly 2 decades had passed since Prince Albert's death, and still the Queen dressed in black, her rooms dimly lit, her heart sealed to the world. The great empire moved in her name, yet she moved through it like a ghost. In letters to her ministers she wrote of duties, of policies, of colonies and commerce, but her private journals told another story, one of emptiness and longing. She had known love once, a love so consuming that even the crown had seemed lighter when Albert was beside her. And then when death took him, the crown became a chain. It was the summer of 1887, the year chosen to celebrate 50 years of her reign, the golden jubilee of Queen Victoria. London prepared itself for spectacle. Soldiers drilled, bands rehearsed, the streets polished for the parades of empire. From every corner of the world came gifts and emissaries, princes from India, envoys from Africa, ambassadors from the far Pacific. The Queen watched it all with weary eyes. The jubilee, she felt, was not a celebration of her happiness, but of her endurance. Among the preparations was a small, seemingly trivial gesture arranged by her officials in India. 2 young Indian attendants were to be sent to serve Her Majesty during the Jubilee festivities. It was meant to be symbolic, a nod to India's loyalty to the crown. No one imagined that this decision would alter the last years of Victoria's life, or ignite one of the most extraordinary friendships in royal history. One of those attendants was a tall, slender man of 22 named Abdul Karim. He was a clerk at the Agra Central Jail, educated enough to read and write English, respectful, intelligent, and eager to see the world beyond the heat-soaked plains of India. When he boarded the ship bound for England, he carried with him little more than a few letters of introduction, a gift of Indian spices and a photograph of his family. He could not have guessed that history would soon know him as the Munshi, the teacher, the companion, the man who captured the heart of an empress. The sea voyage took 6 weeks. Karim was seasick much of the way, wrapped in a wool blanket and staring out at the endless water, wondering what awaited him in the land of fog and etiquette. He had heard tales of England, of palaces that shone with mirrors and gaslight, of people who spoke softly but looked through you as though you were invisible. He prayed quietly each morning, asking Allah to give him courage. When the ship docked at Portsmouth, he saw the grey sky of England for the first time. He was led to Windsor Castle, where the Queen was staying for the Jubilee. The ceremony was a grand affair. Cannons thundered, bells rang, and the crowds cheered for the small figure in a carriage who smiled faintly beneath her black veil. And somewhere amid that pageantry, Abdul Karim stood among the servants, clutching a silver dish, waiting for the moment he would be presented. The Queen noticed him almost at once. She would later write in her diary that, the younger of the 2 Indians, Abdul Karim, is tall with a fine serious countenance and much grace. It was a simple observation, but behind it lay curiosity, perhaps even a spark of something she could not yet name. After the formal dinner, she asked that the young man be assigned to her personal service. At first, Abdul's duties were humble. He served at table, carried messages, and helped with the presentation of Indian dishes at the royal banquets. Yet something about him drew the Queen's attention again and again. He spoke with a calm dignity rare among those who trembled in her presence. When he bowed, it was not the mechanical gesture of a servant but the graceful salute of a man who honored his faith and himself. Within days she began speaking to him directly, asking about his homeland, about Agra, about the palaces and the Taj Mahal that she had seen only in photographs. Abdul answered shyly at first, but soon found himself telling stories of the Yamuna River, of mango trees in bloom, of monsoon rains that scented the earth. The Queen listened as though hearing poetry. In those moments she was no longer an empress but a woman transported to another world, a world of color and heat and youth. She ordered that Abdul Karim be given English lessons so they might converse more easily. He, in turn, began teaching her words of Hindustani, and the Queen delighted in repeating them to her household, often mispronouncing them to the amusement of her Indian attendants. In time, she insisted that he teach her formally, not merely phrases but the written script. Thus began their lessons in Urdu, lessons that would continue almost daily for more than a decade. Soon she promoted him, first to personal attendant, then to the unprecedented title of Munshi to the Queen Empress. He moved from the servants' quarters to a suite nearer her apartments, an elevation that startled and angered the royal household. Courtiers whispered that the old queen had lost her senses. Ministers exchanged worried notes about the Indian influence. Yet Victoria ignored them all. She had found at last someone who spoke to her as a person, not as a monarch. Her letters from that period reveal the depth of her attachment. "The Munshi gives me much pleasure with his intelligence and good manners," she wrote. "He is patient and clever, and I have learned many new words today." Each entry became more affectionate. "He is a wonderful young man, so attentive and gentle. I am fond of him and he of me." The language was simple but charged with warmth. The court's disapproval only deepened her affection. She had always been stubborn. Opposition hardened her will. When her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, protested that the servants were gossiping about the Queen's Indian favorite, she dismissed him curtly. "You are jealous," she said, "and unjust." She saw in Abdul not a servant but a symbol of the empire's unity, and perhaps more truthfully, a mirror of the humanity she longed to find amid her isolation. Karim, for his part, seemed both devoted and astonished. He had never dreamed of dining with a queen, much less teaching one. He wrote home to his father, describing the palaces, the green lawns, the strange cold light of English mornings. "Her Majesty is very kind to me," he said. "I feel as though I have been chosen for some divine purpose." Yet the kindness he received from the Queen earned him resentment from nearly everyone else. Servants refused to bow to him, officers ignored him, and the newspapers hinted that he was dangerous, ambitious, perhaps even a spy. Still, the friendship deepened. In photographs from the late 1880s, Victoria sits beside Abdul Karim, not before him. In one, she is seated while he stands slightly behind, his gaze steady, his expression calm. To modern eyes it seems ordinary, but to Victorians it was scandalous. A servant, an Indian, placed so close to the sovereign. The Queen, unbothered, ordered more portraits taken. By the early 1890s she wrote to him almost daily, sometimes twice a day when he was away. She had small gifts delivered to his room. A gold watch, a book of poetry, even a photograph of herself inscribed in Urdu. When he fell ill, she visited him personally, bringing broth and fruit, acts that horrified her courtiers but moved the young man to tears. "You are very good and noble, my queen," he said softly, and she replied, "And you are my faithful friend." In the evenings, they sometimes walked in the gardens of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. The Queen would lean on her cane, speaking slowly in the chill air, and Abdul would match his pace to hers. He recited verses from the Persian poets, Hafiz, Rumi, and she listened, fascinated by the rhythm and mystery of the language. She began to sign her notes to him not merely Victoria R.I., but sometimes Your Loving Mother. Yet there were letters where the tone shifted, tender and yearning, as though the boundaries between maternal affection and something deeper had blurred. Rumors multiplied. The Times hinted at improprieties. The Prime Minister worried that the Queen might bestow a title too high upon her servant. When she attempted to make him a knight, the government blocked it quietly. Still she persisted, granting him medals, lands in India, and a position of confidence that eclipsed even her private secretaries. In her mind it was simple, she trusted him. "The Munshi is indispensable," she wrote. "No one can replace him." As the years passed, the Queen aged visibly. Her eyesight dimmed, her steps slowed, yet her letters to Abdul remained full of warmth and curiosity. She asked about his family, about the health of his father. She arranged for his wife and mother-in-law to come to England, building them a small house near her estate. The royal household was outraged. Indian women, veiled and speaking no English, living within sight of the Queen's residence. But Victoria enjoyed their company, often sending food and gifts, curious about their customs. To her, it was another window into the land she called the jewel of the crown. And yet, beneath the surface of this unlikely friendship, tension simmered. The courtiers plotted quietly to remove him. They spied on his correspondence, intercepted letters, and fed the press with stories of arrogance. Abdul did not help his case. Emboldened by the Queen's favor, he began to behave with the confidence of rank, giving orders to servants and speaking his mind in matters of etiquette. Some said he had grown proud, even insolent. Whether true or not, it provided ammunition for those who despised him. The Queen, however, remained steadfast. "They are cruel to him because he is Indian," she wrote bitterly. "I will not allow it." When her son again demanded that Karim be sent home, she answered with a single word, "Never." The relationship had become a fortress against the loneliness of her later years, a companionship that defied the rigid hierarchies of empire. In 1897, as her Diamond Jubilee approached, 60 years on the throne, she insisted that Abdul accompany her carriage in the procession. The image of the old queen and her Indian confidant traveling side by side through the cheering streets of London infuriated the establishment but delighted the crowds. Few understood who he was, fewer still guessed the depth of the bond between them. That night, after the fireworks and celebrations, the queen wrote in her diary, "It was a splendid day. My loyal subjects rejoiced and my dear Munshi shared in my happiness." She was 80 years old, frail but still fierce in her affections. Not long after, Abdul's health began to fail. The damp English winters were harsh on him, and the constant hostility took its toll. The queen worried endlessly, sending doctors and special foods, scolding him gently for not resting enough. "You must take care," she wrote, "for you are very precious to me." He replied with humility, assuring her of his devotion, "I will serve until my last breath, Your Majesty." That was the year the first serious talk of succession reached her ears. Her son, the future Edward VII, made it clear that once he became king, Karim's days of favor would end. The queen refused to believe he would act cruelly. "He will see reason," she said softly. But history would soon prove otherwise. As the century turned and winter settled over England, the queen's strength waned. She grew tired, often drifting into silence during her lessons, her pen trembling as she traced Urdu characters on the page. In one of her last notebooks she wrote simply, "The Munshi has been a comfort beyond words." It was perhaps the truest sentence of her later life. And as the year 1901 dawned, the great clocks of Windsor ticked toward the end of an era. Outside, the empire stretched wider than ever. Inside, an old woman sat by the fire, clutching a letter from a man who had once come to her as a servant and become her dearest friend. The winter of 1900 crept slowly across England, heavy and grey. Inside Osborne House, the Queen's Island retreat, the fires burned day and night, yet the rooms felt cold. The servants whispered that the Queen was fading. Her appetite had lessened, her walks had stopped, and the light in her eyes dimmed to a weary flicker. Only one presence still drew her out of silence, the tall, dark-eyed man who had served her faithfully for nearly 14 years, Abdul Karim. He came quietly each morning, bowing as always, though his back ached and his heart trembled with fear. He could see what the others dared not say aloud. The Queen's strength was ebbing away. The once formidable woman who had commanded armies now spoke softly of dreams and memories, of her husband Albert, of Scotland, of the days when life had been full. Yet even in her weakness, her mind reached for warmth. "Munshi," she would whisper, "read to me." And he would take out the worn Urdu notebook, turning the pages with care, reading aloud in a low voice. She listened, eyes closed, as the language rolled like distant music, words she no longer fully understood but loved for their rhythm. To the household, this ritual was intolerable. The courtiers wanted the Indian gone. They waited like vultures for the inevitable, knowing that when Victoria's heart stopped beating, so would his fortune. They watched his every step, catalogued every gift the Queen gave him, and prepared lists of grievances to present to the future king. There was talk of treachery, of impropriety, even of blackmail. Yet through it all, the Queen remained defiant. "He has been loyal," she told her doctors. "He will remain with me until the end." In those last weeks, she insisted that Abdul sit with her longer, sometimes late into the night. He would speak of India, of mango trees, of music drifting over the Yamuna, of the scent of jasmine after rain. Her eyes would mist and she would murmur, "How I should like to see it once more." Then, as exhaustion overcame her, she would add softly, "But I shall see it soon, in another life." The Queen's death came quietly on January 22, 1901. The empire she ruled seemed to stop breathing for a moment. Church bells tolled, cannons fired across the sea, and black banners hung from every palace gate. In the royal chamber, Abdul stood among the attendants, his head bowed. He was not permitted to approach the bed. The courtiers had ordered him to keep his distance. Yet as they covered her face and the physicians declared her gone, he whispered a prayer under his breath, an old Urdu verse for the peace of the departed. Within hours, the tide turned against him. The moment the new king, Edward VII, assumed the throne, he summoned his mother's officials. "The Munshi is to leave England," he said coldly. "At once." There was no mourning period, no courtesy. A detachment of guards arrived at Abdul's quarters that very evening. He was ordered to pack his belongings and prepare for departure. The servants who once envied him now avoided his eyes. The courtiers who had bowed before him now spat the word "foreigner" under their breath. Before he left, Abdul asked to see the Queen's coffin one last time. The request was denied. He was told the new king's command was absolute. Heartbroken, he went to the small chapel, knelt alone, and placed his hand upon the cold stone floor. "May Allah grant her peace," he murmured. "She was my queen and my friend." The next morning soldiers searched his rooms. Every letter, every photograph, every note written in her hand was seized. Boxes of gifts and trinkets were opened and inspected. Those that bore the queen's handwriting were burned in the courtyard under royal orders. Smoke drifted into the winter air, the smoke of a friendship erased. The king himself visited to ensure the deed was done. "No trace of this nonsense shall remain," he said. It was a disgrace. Karim stood by helplessly, watching the fire devour the paper on which the queen's words had once flowed. He thought of the first time she had called him dear friend, of her laughter when she practiced her Urdu, of the gentle tremor in her hand as she signed her name. Now all of it was ash. He was escorted from the palace grounds in a carriage flanked by guards. No one waved farewell. From the harbor, as the ship pulled away from the English shore, he gazed back at the island where he had lived a dream now extinguished. The waves carried him home to India, but his heart remained buried somewhere in the gardens of Osborne. Back in Agra, his reception was bittersweet. The British authorities there knew his name and not with affection. His estate, which the Queen had granted him, was quietly reduced in status. His pension was delayed, his correspondence monitored. Still he tried to rebuild his life. He lived in a large house surrounded by fruit trees and white peacocks, a silent echo of the grandeur he had once known. On his walls hung portraits of the Queen, not the official ones but small photographs he had hidden and smuggled home in his luggage. Each night he lit a lamp before them and whispered prayers in her memory. Visitors described him as dignified yet melancholy, a man haunted by the past. He dressed in fine silks, wore the medal she had pinned on his chest, and kept her letters locked away, the few that survived the purge. Sometimes he read them aloud to trusted friends, his voice trembling. "She called me her faithful servant," he would say softly, "but I was more than that. I was her student and she was my protector." The years slipped by. The empire she had built grew restless. Voices of independence rose across India. To the new generation, Abdul Karim was an enigma, an Indian who had lived in the heart of British power, loved by the Queen herself, yet scorned by her court. Some viewed him with admiration, others with suspicion. But to himself, he was simply a man who had once been seen and understood by a lonely woman on a distant throne. He died quietly in 1909 at the age of 46. His health had never recovered from the damp winters of England. Before his death, he asked that his diaries and letters be buried with him, but his family kept them hidden instead, fearful of British retaliation. For decades they remained locked away, known only to his descendants, until time and memory blurred the edges of the story. Back in England, his name was almost forgotten. The official histories of Queen Victoria's reign made no mention of the Munshi. The archives contained no letters, no portraits, no trace. It was as though he had never existed. The royal family maintained its silence. When historians asked about the Queen's Indian servant, they were told vaguely that he had been dismissed for misconduct. No one questioned further. But the truth has a way of waiting. A century later, long after both the Queen and her Munshi had turned to dust, a researcher working in the royal archives stumbled upon a strange clue, an Urdu notebook written in the Queen's own hand. The script was careful, almost childlike, the ink faded but legible. It was a language the monarch of Britain had learned not for diplomacy, but for affection. Soon more volumes were found, tucked among forgotten boxes at Windsor. They told of lessons, of friendship, of warmth unrecorded in official histories. And then, across the oceans in India, a journalist named Sharbani Basu traced the lineage of Abdul Karim's family. In a modest home near Agra, she discovered an old trunk filled with letters, photographs, and diaries. The papers bore the royal insignia, the Queen's signature, and the seal of her household. Here, at last, was the voice that history had silenced. When the letters were read together, they revealed a story of mutual trust and tenderness, a story that had survived the flames. In one surviving note, written in the Queen's final years, she addressed him simply, "My dear Munshi, I miss you greatly and trust in God that you are well. You have brought me comfort and instruction, and I shall ever be grateful for your friendship." These were not the words of a ruler to a servant. They were the words of one human being reaching out to another across the barriers of empire, race, and power. The discovery shocked historians and delighted readers. Books were written, films produced, and the world was reminded that even within the cold machinery of empire, there had existed a friendship that defied its rules. Yet beyond the romance and controversy, there lies something simpler and more profound. an old woman's yearning for connection, and a young man's loyalty that asked for nothing in return. Today, if you walk through the gardens of Osborne House, you can still find traces of their story. Near a quiet path stands a small stone seat, said to be the Queen's favorite spot for reading with her Munshi. The wind carries the sound of the sea, the same sea that once separated them forever. And if you close your eyes, you might imagine the murmur of their voices, hers gentle, his respectful, as they shared words in two languages, weaving a bridge between worlds. In that space, time softens. The Queen is no longer the Empress of India, and Abdul Karim is no longer her servant. They are two souls bound by loneliness and curiosity, finding solace in each other's company. History may have tried to erase him, but memory endures, not in palaces or statues, but in the quiet truth that even the most powerful heart can long for understanding. The story of Queen Victoria and Abdul Karim is not one of scandal alone, nor of forbidden affection, but of humanity, fragile, complex, and enduring. It reminds us that beneath the titles and the crowns, every ruler is still just a person, reaching for friendship in a world that often forbids it. The year was 2001. 100 years had passed since the Queen's death. The empire she once ruled had dissolved into history, its territories now free nations. The sun had long since set on that vast dominion over which she had once reigned. But history, as it often does, began to stir, softly at first, then with growing urgency. It began in an archive room, deep inside Windsor Castle. Dust hung in the air like faint ghosts. A researcher turned the brittle pages of an old inventory, tracing the faded ink that listed the possessions of Queen Victoria. Most of the names were familiar: courtiers, soldiers, family. But one stood out, repeated across several pages: Abdul Karim, the Munshi. Who was this man, this Indian name appearing so often in the Queen's private papers? Curiosity became investigation. And soon, behind those castle walls, fragments began to surface, traces of a friendship long buried beneath royal silence. Among the Queen's journals, pages written in an unfamiliar hand appeared, smooth, rounded Urdu script, practiced but uncertain. It was her handwriting. The Queen of England had written in an Indian language. And there, within the same volumes, she spoke of lessons, of letters, of affection. She called him my dear Munshi, my true friend. She wrote of his wife, his family, his health. She expressed worry when he was ill and gratitude when he returned from India. These were not the distant words of a monarch to a servant. They were intimate, personal, human. News of the discovery rippled quietly through the academic world, and eventually reached the ears of a woman in London, a journalist and historian named Sharbani Basu. She had been researching the origins of curry in Britain, tracing the influence of Indian culture on Victorian society. But when she saw the name Abdul Karim in the Queen's journals, something caught her attention. She wanted to know who he was, what his story had been, and why his name had disappeared from history. Her search took her from the archives of Windsor to the dusty lanes of Agra, India. There, amid the ruins of the old British cantonment, she found descendants of Abdul Karim still living quietly, their family stories whispered through generations. They welcomed her with warmth, offering tea and memories. And in a small trunk, worn, locked, and half forgotten, she found the missing pieces of history. Inside were letters in Queen Victoria's handwriting, official documents bearing royal seals, and dozens of photographs showing the Munshi beside the Queen, not in the background but standing near her, smiling, trusted, close. There were letters signed simply VRI, Victoria Regina Imperatrix, the Queen's personal mark. Some were written in English, others in Urdu, their tone affectionate, even maternal. As Sharbani read through them, she realized she was holding something explosive. For a century, historians had accepted the royal family's narrative, that Abdul Karim had been an overreaching servant, dismissed for arrogance. But the letters told another truth, one of deep trust and mutual loyalty. When her book Victoria and Abdul was finally published, it shattered the polite silence surrounding that chapter of royal history. Newspapers erupted with fascination and controversy. Some hailed it as a beautiful cross-cultural friendship that defied the racism of its time. Others called it an embarrassment, a private matter that should have stayed buried. But whatever people thought, the story could no longer be erased. For the first time in generations, the world saw Queen Victoria not as the stern empress on a coin or a statue, but as a lonely woman who had found solace in the kindness of another human being, a man the world had taught her to consider beneath her. It was, in every sense, revolutionary. The more the story spread, the more people began to reflect on what it revealed, not just about Victoria but about empire itself. How strange, how ironic that the most powerful woman on earth, who ruled millions across India, should have turned to one of her Indian subjects for comfort and companionship. The very structure of imperial power seemed to bend in that small, private relationship. Abdul Karim, after all, was no nobleman. He had arrived in England in 1887 as a simple clerk, sent to serve as a waiter at the Queen's Golden Jubilee. He was chosen almost at random, one among many. But from that chance beginning had grown a connection that would scandalize a nation and survive every attempt to destroy it. Now, with the rediscovery of his letters and journals, Abdul Karim's name was no longer a footnote. He was real again, a man of warmth and intelligence, fluent in Urdu, Persian, and Hindustani, proud of his heritage and deeply loyal to the Queen who had lifted him from obscurity. In 2017, more than a century after his death, the story reached millions through the film Victoria and Abdul, starring Judi Dench as the aging monarch. The movie brought the hidden friendship to life with tenderness and humor. Audiences wept, laughed, and marveled. Some left theaters questioning what they had been taught about colonial history. Others left reflecting on the simple truth at its heart, that friendship, genuine and unguarded, can exist even in the most unlikely places. And yet, beyond the glamour of cinema and the headlines of rediscovery, lies the quieter reality. The real Abdul Karim did not live to see his story redeemed. He died believing the world had turned against him. His grave in Agra bears a simple epitaph, written in Urdu, asking God for mercy. There is no mention of his royal friendship, no symbol of his once great position. But for those who know the story, that simplicity holds its own power. Because what he and Queen Victoria shared was not built for spectacle. It was not meant for history books or grand monuments. It was built on something much smaller, much rarer: compassion. The Queen, trapped in her own isolation, found in Abdul a reminder of youth, of curiosity, of the vast, colorful world beyond her court. And Abdul, though humble, found in her something almost sacred: respect. He never betrayed her. He never published her secrets, never used her name for gain. Even when the court humiliated him, even when the new king stripped him of everything, he remained silent. That silence, in its dignity, became his final act of loyalty. And so, when we speak of them now, it is not just as monarch and servant, but as symbols of something more enduring, the possibility that empathy can exist where it should not, that humanity can slip through the cracks of power and prejudice. It is said that time erases all things. But sometimes time gives back what power tried to hide. Today, in the grand corridors of Windsor, the Queen's Urdu journals are once again on display. Tourists walk past glass cases where her handwriting loops across the page, graceful and deliberate. The words are simple lessons: my heart is happy, I am pleased with my Munshi. But they carry centuries of weight. Outside, in the gardens of Osborne, a statue of Queen Victoria stands as it has for over 100 years, gazing toward the horizon. Tourists pose, cameras flash, and few notice the quiet plaque nearby that mentions Abdul Karim by name. Yet his presence lingers, not in marble but in memory. Theirs was not a perfect story. It was full of tension, misunderstanding, and scandal. But within it lies a truth about the human heart, that it longs to be seen, to be understood, even by those we are told to fear. The Queen who ruled the world found her peace not in politics or conquest, but in the company of a man from the land she ruled. And he, in turn, found dignity in serving her, not as a subject but as a friend. When night falls over Osborne House, the air still smells faintly of salt and roses. The sea whispers beyond the cliffs, carrying with it echoes of voices long gone. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint sound of Urdu lessons drifting through the corridors, the Queen's laughter, the Munshi's patient corrections, the murmur of two hearts speaking across an empire. For in the end, every empire fades, every monument crumbles. But the small acts of kindness, the ones born of understanding, trust, and compassion, they remain. And that, perhaps, is why their story refuses to die. History is rarely kind to those who challenge its expectations. For a century, Queen Victoria and Abdul Karim lived in silence, their friendship folded away in archives and family shame. Yet somehow, across the decades, their story survived, like a candle still burning in a sealed room, waiting for someone to open the door. When that door finally opened, the light revealed not scandal, but something achingly ordinary and therefore extraordinary: two human beings who dared to see each other beyond the boundaries the world had built. Think of the world they lived in. The late 19th century, an age of empire and arrogance, where hierarchy ruled every breath. Class divided the British, race divided the empire, and loneliness divided even the powerful. The Queen sat at the center of it all, adored yet isolated, her crown both her glory and her cage. Around her swirled courtiers and politicians, men who bowed deeply but rarely listened. And then came Abdul, young, foreign, unafraid to meet her gaze. He did not see an empress carved in marble. He saw a woman yearning to understand the world she ruled. In teaching her his language, he unknowingly taught her humility, the art of learning again at the end of life. He taught her words that tasted of spice and sunlight, words that belonged to another world entirely. She in return gave him what few could imagine: trust. A place at her side, a voice that mattered, a friendship that defied the empire's logic. In the quiet hours of their lessons, the vast machinery of British rule, armies, ministers, the pomp of court, all seemed to fade, leaving only two people sitting across from one another, trading words and smiles. And yet, as every story of light must have its shadow, so did theirs. The palace watched with suspicion. The royal family bristled. To them, Abdul Karim was a threat, not because he wielded power but because he had her heart. The very idea that an Indian Muslim could hold affection from the Queen of England was intolerable to those who measured worth by blood and class. They whispered. They plotted. They invented stories of manipulation, of greed, of secret influence. But none of them could erase what the Queen herself had written in her own hand: "I am happy with my Munshi." The tragedy of their tale is not that it ended, for all stories must, but that the world tried so hard to pretend it never happened. It burned the letters, the photographs, the diaries. It buried him under a mountain of silence. And yet here we are, still telling it. Perhaps because in some small way, it speaks to something we all understand: the longing to be seen for who we truly are, not what the world expects us to be. For Queen Victoria, Abdul Karim was a mirror, not of empire but of empathy. Through him, she glimpsed the richness of a culture her empire had conquered but never truly known. She learned that understanding could not be commanded, it had to be earned, word by word, lesson by lesson. For Abdul, the Queen was not a goddess to be worshipped, but a lonely human being who needed kindness. He never mocked her curiosity or her broken Urdu. He listened. He smiled. He served faithfully even when the world turned cruel. And when she died and the fire consumed their letters, he said nothing. Silence was his last gift to her, a loyalty the empire did not deserve but somehow received. Years later, when his descendants told their children about the Queen, they did not speak of power or wealth. They said she had been a good woman who respected our ancestor. In that sentence lies all that matters. Because at its heart, this is not just the story of a queen and her servant. It is a story about courage, the courage to reach across an ocean of difference and say, "I see you." It is about how empathy can live even inside the coldest palace. How language can become a bridge between two worlds. And how love, not romantic love, but the quiet, enduring love of friendship, can outlast even the weight of empire. When we look at their portraits today, framed in galleries and museums, we are tempted to see only history. But look longer and you might see something more. In her eyes, softness. In his, pride. A strange equality, impossible yet undeniable. Their friendship reminds us that history is not made only by those who conquer, but also by those who connect. It asks a question that still matters. What does it mean to be human in a world that divides us? For Queen Victoria, that answer came late in life. After decades of ruling, commanding, and being obeyed, she discovered that true power was not in domination, but in understanding. The empire she built has long vanished, but the compassion she learned in those lessons with Abdul remains part of her legacy, whispered between pages, remembered in stories like this. And for Abdul Karim, though his name was nearly erased, his story endures. It endures because it refuses to fit neatly into the categories history loves. He was neither villain nor saint, neither revolutionary nor opportunist. He was simply a man who dared to be kind, and who bore the cost of that kindness with quiet dignity. Sometimes, that is the greatest rebellion of all. So when we speak of their friendship, we are really speaking of something larger, of how empathy moves through time, defying the fire that tries to destroy it. The Queen's letters burned to ash, but her words survived in memory. His grave lies quiet in Agra, but his spirit walks the gardens of Osborne still, unseen yet not forgotten. Listen. The sea beyond the cliffs whispers the same sound it did a century ago. The gulls cry, the wind carries the scent of salt and history. Somewhere in that sound is the echo of Urdu and English mingling together, two voices, two worlds, bound by one fragile thread of understanding. Perhaps that is the lesson they left us, that history's truest power does not lie in crowns or conquests, but in the courage to care for another soul. And so the story ends where it began, not in the noise of empire, but in the quiet of human connection. A queen who ruled the world. A man who served her tea. And between them, a bridge that neither time nor prejudice could destroy. Because in the end, even after the thrones crumble and the empires fade, what remains, what always remains, are the hearts that dared to reach beyond their borders. And that is why, more than a century later, we still whisper their names. Queen Victoria. Abdul Karim. The Empress and the Munshi. 2 lives, 1 friendship. And a reminder that even in the grandest halls of power, the most lasting legacy is simple human kindness.